Hi, folks. Dakota Cohen here from Cohen Farms. We're going to be doing an interview today with Deborah Morgan from Kids Health Revolution down in Calgary, Alberta. And we're going to be talking all about health, wellness, food, nutrition, particularly from a kid's perspective. So, Deborah, thanks for being on the call today. And why don't you tell us a bit about yourself and what got you into working with kids?
Hi, Dakota. Thanks for having me on. Yes, well, my journey into helping kids with their health started 7 years ago when my son was 2 years old. Excuse me. He was diagnosed with an autoimmune condition. We took him in to have what we thought was something very innocent checked out. And our whole lives changed that day. We found out that he has an autoimmune condition. And what was most frightening about that for me was that his condition wasn't a life-threatening condition, but it was something that we would constantly have to monitor to make sure that his immune system wasn't attacking other more serious organs of his body, because now I understand once the immune system has gone rogue, it can kind of go anywhere and attack any part of the self. So that was really frightening to me, and unfortunately we weren't given many options or solutions from the mainstream medical approach. There was some steroid creams and things that we could use, most of them with not so great results, and this long laundry list of side effects that it would have on him, especially if using it on such a small child. So we chose to sort of wait on that and see what happened. And while we were doing that, we just decided to start doing some research and see what was out there in terms of natural alternatives. Excuse me, I have a little frog in my throat. But to see what else could potentially treat this condition, because everything we were being offered from mainstream medical was symptom. It was only the outward symptom. We weren't looking at what was going on inside his little body that was making his immune system freak out and attack itself. So this started quite a journey, and any parent who has a child who has chronic illness, who's decided to look into alternatives, knows that this is just this crazy web, right? You get into the internet and it's like this, you go down this rabbit hole and you can take years to come out of sometimes. And some crazy snake oil sort of options that popped up, but eventually we came across diet and functional medicine. I was seeing a lot of really positive testimonials from people who had done amazing things by simply changing their diet and doing a gut healing protocol and using some of the other functional medicine approaches. So I thought, well, look, here's something that is totally non-invasive. It has no side effects. And, if this could be the thing that's going to help, then we need to give this a shot, right? We've got to give this a try.
Yeah.
So we did that. We went to a functional medicine. Well, actually, first we eliminated gluten and dairy, and we saw a little bit of improvement, not very much. And then we went to a functional medicine doctor here in Calgary, Dr. Bruce Hoffman, who put us on the specific carbohydrate diet, which I don't know if you've ever heard of. It's similar to the GAPS diet. And I cried in my car when I left that appointment, because we had to really change our lives. We were eliminating processed sugars, all grains from our diet, legumes, soy, dairy, just the whole gamut of things. And I thought, gluten and dairy-free is one thing, but this, like, how in God's name are we going to live any kind of normal life like this? But fortunately for me, I have a dear friend who has a son with autism that she has done amazing things with. And she kind of gave me that kick in the butt that I needed to say, okay, you've got to try this. And I knew that I did. So I came home and I just threw everything in my pantry out, and we just started over. That's my sort of personality. Just rip the Band-Aid off and get it over with.
Yeah.
And a year later, his autoimmune condition started to reverse. So
Wow.
we could see on the outward symptoms that it was reversing, and on his blood marker tests and things that it was actually starting to reverse, which it wasn't supposed to do. So I thought, here's something, right? We're on to something. And that led me back to school, studied holistic nutrition. I got certified in the gut and psychology syndrome diet, and founded Kids Health Revolution.
Wow.
So that, in a not so small nutshell, is my story.
That's really exciting. So you've been now your son was diagnosed 7 years ago, you said.
Yes.
And so like how long have you been working with other parents, helping them with similar issues with their children?
Well, I've been working on Kids Health Revolution for about 4 years now.
Wow. Exciting.
So yeah, and helping them wherever they are in their transition, right? Because not everybody's ready to rip the Band-Aid off and go, that deep a dive right away. So sometimes it's about taking those baby steps and helping people, build right on their progress, and then making the changes that are necessary, because it really depends on the child and what their health condition is in terms of how drastic you need to be. Not everybody needs to go that drastic.
Yeah.
Some kids would see great benefit just from eliminating processed sugars, for example, and eating cleaner food, eating more organic food, and reducing the pesticide load in their bodies. But some kids that have more complex chronic health issues will need to go a little bit deeper in terms of the changes that they make.
Absolutely. So
Mm-hmm.
in terms of the kind of clients that come to you for help, like what are the top three most common, illnesses or issues that they're coming to you with?
Right. Well, I deal a lot with kids with autism. That's probably my main clientele, is children with autism. Some kids with ADHD. Eczema is a really common one. So really little ones, like babies and 1 and 2 year olds, that have terrible eczema all over their body that they're just not getting any relief from. Arthritis. So juvenile arthritis as well.
I've never even heard of that before.
Sorry, what was that?
I've never even heard of juvenile arthritis.
Oh no! Oh yeah, juvenile onset arthritis. Yeah,
Oh my God.
yeah, it's pretty terrible for the little ones. So yeah, those are the main ones I probably see at the moment.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And so those are all, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but those are all kind of autoimmune or inflammatory type illnesses.
Yes, absolutely. So we now know from a lot of the research that's coming out around functional medicine, and even mainstream medicine is starting to accept this more and more. Like, you can find articles on, mainstream WebMD talking about how inflammation is one of the underlying issues for almost every chronic and even non-chronic, like even cancer, can be related back to this chronic inflammatory condition in the body. And so, oftentimes the question is, how does a 1 or 2 year old have chronic inflammation? Like, they haven't been around for that long.
Yeah.
And it starts even in utero. And then, that inflammatory situation just carries on. So absolutely, that's the main link between all of these things. It doesn't matter if it's in the brain or on the skin or the immune system. What we're going after is decreasing that inflammatory fire, as I call it, so that the body can then start to find its proper balance.
Absolutely. And so when it comes to, you mentioned how when you first took your son to the kind of conventional doctors, there's a lot of symptom treatment, steroids, things like that. So with your approach, what are the 5 root causes that you are looking for, like most often, to help get rid of the symptoms, as opposed to?
Right. So if we're looking at, because I'm not a doctor, I can't talk about causes necessarily, but I can talk about, underlying issues. So generally, we always want to look at the gut. And it doesn't matter, again, what kind of health condition we're talking about. The gut and the microflora, the microorganisms that call us home, are two of the most important pieces of that puzzle.
Yeah.
And it's, it's quite complex how this all relates, but again, even mainstream medicine is starting to realize that there is a connection between the gut and the microorganisms, especially, and the immune system and the brain and the neuroimmunobiology and all of these fancy words they have for it. And then there comes leaky gut. So let's see here. How do I want to put it sort of succinctly so we don't have, take up a whole bunch of time? So the microflora, let's start with the microflora. So the microflora that our kids are inheriting is very, very different from the microflora that our grandparents and great-grandparents had. And the major reason for that is because our diet has changed so much, so quickly over that time. So the microflora really depends on a diet really rich in different types of fibers in order to thrive and be balanced. And in the gut, we have this balance of pathogenic, opportunistic, and beneficial bacteria. It's not that it's like the soil. It's not like we want to only have the good guys in there, right? The bad guys have their role. The E. coli, for example, in your gut has its role, but we want to keep it in check. So it's about the beneficial bacteria being more abundant and being able to keep the more sort of bad guys, the gang members, in check, right? So when we start feeding our kids and ourselves this diet that is mostly processed food, refined flours, processed sugars, those are the foods that feed the pathogenic and opportunistic species, but they do not feed our beneficial species. So we are creating this situation where we are bringing this imbalance in. And our kids are the ones, I would say actually, our generation and then our children are starting to show the manifest symptoms of this change, because we're starting to see so much chronic illness in our kids, but also, my generation and maybe, generation just before me is not aging very well because, again, these changes that are taking place. And these gut bacteria, it fascinates a lot of people to know that they actually communicate directly with your brain. The bacteria in your gut are sending signals to your brain telling you to increase inflammation or decrease inflammation. They're driving cravings for food. So lots of times when I work with autistic kids, a lot of them have such an imbalance in their microbiome that they will only eat really refined carbohydrates and sugar. That's all they will accept on their plates. And the reason for that is because those bugs are driving those cravings so that they can thrive and survive. They're intelligent, right? They're like, we need more of this. Let's get more of this in.
Wow.
And so we have to take some fairly drastic action to change that so the child can be broken out of that cycle. It's beyond picky eating.
Wow.
Then this is about, the microorganisms, driving the bus here. So yeah, so that's the first step. We need to go in and provide a diet that's going to create an environment where we can have the proper balance of microflora. And those microflora train the immune system. They are so important in terms of the communication that goes in on our body. And then you have the part about leaky gut. So the microbiome also nourishes the cells that line the intestines. So they're called enterocytes. And these cells have tons of jobs, but one of the jobs is to help the body digest its food and then absorb the food into the bloodstream. So it breaks the food down, it creates the enzymes and things that break the food down, and then it should slip through, once it's broken down properly, into the bloodstream, goes through the liver so the body can use it. But what can happen is these cells are also responsible for being like the gatekeepers. I kind of talk about them like the bouncers of the nightclubs maybe you used to like to go to, maybe still do, I don't know. And they're really selective about who's allowed to get into the nightclub. So you think about the body as the party, and the bouncers are deciding who gets into the party. And they're really choosy about who gets in. So they've got this closed gate system. And if you've got the right code, you can go through. If you look right to these bouncers, they'll let you through and into the bloodstream, into the body party. But if you don't, their job is to say, no, 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 you don't get into this party. You don't belong here. And you're going to be held back in the intestine to be eliminated from the body in the next bowel movement. It's this very protective sort of way that our body eliminates the toxins and the pesticides and the bacteria and the viruses and all the things that we ingest through our mouth.
Yeah.
But what happens is when that microflora is not properly balanced, it's not nourishing those cells. So the bouncers are getting tired, they're falling down on their jobs, and they're getting a little lazy. And so they're letting stuff through that shouldn't be getting through. They're kind of like, well, go ahead, and the virus or the bacteria pass through, or the pesticide passes through, or the undigested food particle, because it can't digest properly, is passing through into the bloodstream. And so this whole process contributes to that chronic state of inflammation in the body, because over 70% of the immune system is around the intestines. So I describe this like the sentry around the castle. So the riffraff comes through that's not supposed to be at the royal party, and the sentry is there, and they mount an attack. So something comes through, a little piece of food that's not digested, or a toxin, and the sentry, the immune system, goes, halt, wait, attack, and brings in the entire immune system to surround that particle with inflammation, which in the short term is really good, right? We want that, we need that. Our inflammatory system is protective. But when that is continuing to happen 24 hours a day, every day, for your whole life, you can see how that inflammation kind of gets out of control.
Yeah.
Right? And that's where we get like food allergies. People who have food allergies, it's because there's some level of leaky gut. If you have any kind of reaction to certain foods, there is some level of leaky gut going on. So that's sort of the foundation. So when I work with parents, I work with I have what I call my parent power pyramid. And so we work on this very foundational level first, because this is where, as parents, the majority of our power our control is in changing the diet. And so then helping the gut and the microflora. And then there's some environmental changes to be made as well, because the things that we put on our skin and that we're breathing in every day also have an effect not only on the gut, but also on that inflammatory state in the body. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, wow.
Yeah, it's a long-winded answer.
No, I've got a bunch of notes here that I wanted to come back to, but holy. Okay. So one of the things that really stood out for me in that was this idea that, just like in the soil, like there are pathogenic, I can't remember what their words used, pathogenic, beneficial, and kind of neutral.
Yeah, opportunistic. Yeah,
opportunistic bacteria and in our bodies, and it's the same thing in the environment. And one of the things that I work with the farmers that I do consulting with is weeds. So weeds are essentially the inflammatory response of the soil. Like whenever like a disturbance or something happens, Mother Nature sends out weeds to cover the soil, heal the conditions, and depending on what so that they've done experiments where they've taken the same piece of ground and like 100 square meters, and they've divided it into 100 1-by-1 meter plots, and they've done different treatments to each of those plots. So they've burned one, they flooded one, they compacted one, they sprayed herbicides on one, they over-fertilized one, they didn't give enough nutrients to another, like a whole bunch of different experiments, but it's the same ground all next to each other. And based on the conditions or the environment, different weed seeds germinate out of the same piece of ground. There's literally hundreds of thousands of weed seeds that exist in every square inch of ground. And depending on what conditions arise. So I always tell farmers is like, manage for what you want, stop managing for what you don't want.
Oh,
And so
interesting.
it's like we should be trying to we're trying to create the conditions for what we want to thrive, as opposed to fighting what we don't want to be there, because
Right.
we can't do that. And that really stuck out for me. The same thing with our guts. It's like, what are we managing for? What are we creating the conditions for to thrive in our bodies?
Exactly. That's exactly right. Yeah. You want to help the good guys thrive, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Because they're going to keep everything else in balance.
Yeah. So in terms of helping the good guys thrive, then what are some really simple things that parents and people of all ages can do to manage for what they want?
Okay, well, there's a simple and a complex answer, and I'm going to give you the simple answer first, and then just a little bit on the complex answer. So, and if I get sidetracked, remind me to go back to the complex part. But so the really quick and simple thing is to eat as much whole food as you can. So, getting rid of as much of the processed, refined flour products out of our diets, especially the processed sugar foods, because those ones are just they have absolutely no nutrient value to them at all whatsoever. In fact, they require our body to use B vitamins in order to digest and process sugar. We actually have to
Wow.
use vitamin B instead of it giving us vitamin B. So
Interesting.
this doesn't mean that you're never having anything sweet or that your kids can't have sweet treats, but you're looking at whole foods sources of those sweets. So, dried fruits and honey, maple syrup, things like that actually have a little bit of nutrient value to them, as well as some sweetness.
Interesting.
So, that's one thing. The processed sugars are the very first thing. And then the refined flours, really, at least cutting back to those. Because when we think about it, if you look at the average North American diet, we're probably having, and if you look at the food pyramid, and it recommends that you have, I don't even remember what it is, 5 to 6 servings of grain products a day.
It's 7 to 10 when I was a kid.
7 to 10. Okay. So but it doesn't specify that, what kind of grain products. So a lot of people are getting those 7 to 10 servings a day, and that includes kids are getting, and those are bread products. Those are the refined carbohydrate products. And again, when we look at nutritional value, there's very little nutritional value in those foods. So we're starting out from a place where our kids aren't getting the nutrient density they need to thrive. And the other thing that's interesting about bread is that it has a greater impact on blood sugar than a teaspoon of straight up sugar. So you could eat a teaspoon of straight up sugar and it would have less of an impact on your blood sugar spike than eating a piece of whole wheat bread. And we know that blood sugar imbalance is another contributor to inflammation in the body. So that's another really good reason that, if we're eating bread, eating it, if you've got the digestive system to break down gluten, then that's fine. But we shouldn't be having it 7 to 10 times a day.
No.
That's just not how we're built. It's not how we're meant to eat.
Yeah.
Do you have a question before I continue rattling on?
No, keep going. I'll come back.
Okay, fair enough. So processed sugars, processed refined flours, and replacing those with more whole foods options. So if you're able to do like a whole foods, some people are able to digest oats, and some of the more ancient sort of grains grown are okay for some people, especially if they're properly processed. So, and what I mean by that is not processed in a plant, but processed in your home, so that you are soaking the grains. So you're removing some of the anti-nutrients from them that make it difficult for them to be digested. Because any food that is like in a seed form that is meant to be able to survive the digestive tract, so the animal eats the plant, the seeds survive the digestive tract, come out in the poop and get planted again. Any plant that we eat that is in that form will resist digestion in our digestive tract as well, especially because we have less of the enzymes to break these foods down. So we need to help our bodies by processing them properly. And that's soaking, using fermentation processes like sourdough and things to help break them down. So those are the sort of the very beginning sort of steps that I would recommend to people. We take out the sugar, we take out the refined flours, we start replacing them with the whole foods, eating more vegetables and fruits and meats and nuts and seeds and these sorts of things. So for some kids, that's going to be enough, and we increase the fiber density in their diet because the good bacteria benefit from fiber. That's what their favorite food is, and that's how they thrive, is fiber. And then here's where we get a little bit more complex, is because some kids and even adults, depending on what's going on in the gut and how unbalanced their microbiome is, the more imbalanced the microbiome is, the less digestive capability they have. So sometimes adding a whole bunch of fiber into some of these kids is the exact wrong thing to do, because it just exacerbates their symptoms because they can't break it down. They just don't have the microflora and the digestive enzymes to do it. So in those cases, that's where we would go in with something like a GAPS diet or a specific carbohydrate diet. And that was my son's case, where we're removing a lot of these foods that are very fibrous and difficult to digest just for a time. And it's kind of like a reset for the gut. So we're also removing all those processed foods. We're starving out the bad guys, and we're giving the good guys a chance to start to replenish. We're giving them nourishing foods that are still easy to digest. And then as time goes by and they start to build back up again, then we can slowly start to reintroduce some of these foods that we had to eliminate for a time. So it's just like a little bit of a reset sort of for the gut. And that allows things to come back online, the digestive enzymes to start to reproduce in there. And the child's gut, the lining, has a chance to start to heal without that constant irritation. If you think of a very inflamed gut and you throw a whole bunch of fiber into that, and the fiber is essentially supposed to act kind of like a rake in our gut, right? It's supposed to kind of rake things down. So it's that bulk so that it helps the bowel movement to flush things out. But if you have a really bad sore on the side of your arm, the last thing you're going to want to do is be scratching at it, right? So that's the reason that we would take out fiber for a time.
Interesting.
Is that an answer to the question?
Yeah. Well, there's one thing that's really coming out for me is just obviously the wholesale nature of this, but just like I'm seeing the huge contrast in like high fiber is promoted as like this really important thing, and like all the breakfast cereals, which are ironically are like there's a whole bunch of processed sugars, and I don't know where they get the fiber from, but they're probably adding it back in some other form.
Yes.
And it's funny how backwards so our understanding about what a healthy diet is, and it's just like, in your opinion, how did we get to where we are today? How did we get so wrong?
Oh boy, that's a huge question. How did we get so wrong? I'm not sure it was all bad intentioned. A lot of the articles you read about the invention of processed food talks about, the Second World War, and, having to have foods that were non-perishable, and these sorts of things. Convenience played into it. It's a little bit like the birth control pill. The birth control pill was a boom for women. It was this freedom. But now we're realizing that there are these other consequences and side effects to this. And I think convenience and processed foods are similar. It's a weird comparison, but, women, I think at a time in their lives where they felt very stuck sort of in the kitchen and doing all of these things. Convenience foods came along, and it was like, look at all this time we have, but at what cost? And I think that there's a movement to coming back to the kitchen and realizing that it doesn't have to be this sort of chained to the kitchen experience, that it can be a pleasant experience to be in the kitchen and preparing foods for your family, whether you're the mother or the father of the family, or you live on your own preparing your own food, and it doesn't have to be that much work either. But I think the convenience foods, I think were born partially out of that, and then of course there's the side to it that's a little bit about the economics of it, and that as pushing some of the grain products and some of the studies that came out against fat, and that whole story about how we got into this high fiber grains being the base of our pyramid, and everything else playing a lesser role, was more about profit for large corporate agriculture than it really was about nutrition. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Does that jive with what you know about it?
Yeah. Well, I mean, and some of the research that I've done as well is just outright, collusion and, the falsification of scientific studies and just outright manipulation that took place. And some of it's coming out right now. I know Sally Fallon and what's her, Mary Enig, they've written several books about one on bone broth, one on the fats and things like that, and like all the research that was done in the 30s and 40s was it was just bogus. And they're coming out now saying, it was false, and people need to start eating saturated fats again.
Yeah, they just threw out evidence that didn't match, right? The stuff that didn't kind of go with what they wanted, they kind of just got rid of that part of the population and kept the stuff that they wanted in the research. So yeah, absolutely.
So from your perspective, how do healthy fats fit into and bone broth? I know we chatted about that in the last conversation. How does that fit into the GAPS diet and kind of the rest of your process when you're working with autoimmune diseases?
Yeah, well, let's start with the bone broth, because there's a lot of hype out there about bone broth at the moment, and so there's two different from the GAPS diet perspective. There's bone broth, and then there's meat stock. And bone broth has its place, but when we're talking about going in and healing and sealing the gut and starting at this very foundational phase, what we're actually looking for is more of a meat stock, as opposed to a bone broth. And there's a couple of reasons for that. So I'll describe what I mean by a meat stock. So a meat stock still has the bones, but they're really the meaty joints. So you want a lot of meat and a lot of that cartilage around those joints, because that's where you get a lot of the particular amino acids from that really feed and heal the enterocyte cells, those intestinal cells. So there's more collagen in that part. There's proline, there's glycine, there's L-glutamine, and those are the particular amino acids that really feed those intestinal cells. So we would start off with the meat stock. And another reason for that is a meat stock is cooked for less time. So we only cook it for about 6 hours. And especially for some children that have neurological conditions, autism or ADHD, asthma and eczema, they tend to be a little bit sensitive to histamines. And as you know, histamines build up on food as it ages. So the longer we cook a bone broth, the more histamine that's going to be produced from it.
Interesting.
Is the same as fermented foods. So sometimes we have to start out very slowly with fermented foods with these kids to allow their bodies to adjust to it. So we would start with a meat stock, and then as the healing takes place, then we can transition into more of a bone broth. And so what in the GAPS diet, and Dr. Natasha Campbell McBride talks about with the bone broth, then that's when we're talking about taking, like you've roasted a chicken and then you've taken most of the meat off of it, and you have mostly just bare bones, maybe a little bit of meat on there, and you simmer that for, you know, anywhere from 24 to 48 hours. That's a true bone broth, and you're going to have more mineralization in that broth than you will in the meat stock. But in terms of healing the gut, we're really looking at having the meat stock rather than the minerals from the bone broth. Does that make sense?
Interesting. Yeah. I mean, I've never seen that delineated before or heard that delineated before, but that makes tons of sense.
Yeah, and so then the fat side of it comes in as well, because when we're getting the really meaty joints, so if you put a chicken carcass in, and chicken carcasses are great because they've got all the little tiny bones, and chicken feet in, and you put something with some skin in, or you know, you've got some beef bones or some pork bones that have got fat on them, we're getting the fat into the broth as well. And so it's always a bit of a re-education to say to people, do not skim that fat off. The fat itself is nourishing to the gut. It has certain fatty acids in it that feed those enterocyte cells as well. You know, all of our cells, all of our cell membranes are made up of fat. So our bodies require fat. Our brain is, 70% fat, something to that effect. So again, and you know, that myelin sheath that covers all of our nerves, that's fat. So the idea that we should not be eating fat is ludicrous. Our bodies need that fat in order to form these parts of our bodies to have healthy cell membranes. So yeah, I think that answers both questions.
Interesting. So now one of the, you know, the common things that you know, I hear a lot when I'm, you know, talking to other people, and when like some of the people who get pork and beef from us, they want everything lean, on our cutting instructions, and I'm constantly trying to educate them. It's like, actually, no, you want the fat. That's like the best part of the animal. But one of the things they always say is, well, you know, I have to watch my cholesterol. Mm-hmm. And I'm just wondering what your perspective on the relationship between eating fat and cholesterol is, and how that ties in with inflammation. Because I'd love to hear your perspective.
That's a really complex question, because there are some studies that show that eating saturated fat along with a high carbohydrate diet, diet high in refined grains, can indeed have problems causing issues with cholesterol, especially when there's a lot of sugar and those refined products. So combining the two does seem to be a bit of a problem. But if we're just talking about eating an ancestral diet where we're including the saturated fats in our diets and way less of these or no processed foods at all, then we don't see the same association between the saturated fats and the cholesterol. So it's this sort of balancing act. If the person is eating, you know, really well, then it's probably not a concern. We don't worry about it at all in our house.
Yeah.
And my cholesterol is great. So we eat almost exclusively saturated fat. Yeah. I cook with duck fat. I do cook with some lard. I use ghee and things like that to cook with, and I don't have any issues with my cholesterol.
Yeah.
So if you have a genetic issue where you're producing too much cholesterol, again, that can be a problem. But for the most part, most people can get away with eating the saturated fats as long as they're cutting back on the processed foods that are really the contributors to the inflammation. Because the new thought on cholesterol is that just because it's at the scene of the crime doesn't mean it's the culprit, right? Yeah. And we know that cholesterol is a repair mechanism in the body. So there is a thought that it's actually high blood sugar that's the problem and causing the damage in the arteries, in the circulatory system, and cholesterol is coming in to try and heal that, and in the process sort of clogging things up. So the whole situation's not good, but it's actually the sugar and the high blood sugar that's the problem in the first place.
Absolutely, yeah, and that's what I was referring to. I've heard a really interesting analogy that, like if making the assumption that cholesterol is the root cause of the problem is like saying, because firemen are always at fires, they must be the ones that are starting them.
They're the arsonists.
Yeah, they're the arsonists, and so it's like, like whenever there's damage in the body, yeah, the cholesterol is the first one to show up and try to deal with that inflammation, because it's trying to coat it and, like, cover that scarring that you're talking about, like, so that the fiber and everything else can't break.
Exactly.
If you're just constantly putting more inflammation in, you can get build up there. But yeah, the root cause isn't necessarily the cholesterol, which is again a very simple observation, but I mean, on an intuitive level, it makes a lot of sense. And when we look back at a lot of traditional diets that were 40 to 80% fats, and this kind of ties into Weston A. Price, which I don't think we've mentioned today, but yeah, could you for folks who aren't familiar, could you give a bit of background on the Weston A. Price diet and just this idea of traditional diets and some of the principles that it's founded on?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, Weston A. Price, I'm quite familiar with it. It's not my specialty, but the GAPS diet certainly took a lot of aspects of the Weston A. Price diet into consideration when she designed her diet, and she does a lot of work with them, as well as with Sally Fallon. So essentially, there was a fellow, Weston A. Price, and he is a dentist, and he went out and did a lot of studies on different traditional populations and their diets. And he primarily looked at facial structure, if I'm correct, and the jaw structure and dental as indicators of overall strength and robust health. And what he found was that among other things, that these people were eating diets that included meats. They did include some plants. They included no processed foods, no processed sugars, and they were eating saturated fats. But what was, I think, most interesting about that is that it also depended on the sort of region that they lived in. Yes. So there was some specificity in terms of what the healthiest diet was for them, depending on where they were from. And therefore, we see that potentially genetics play a role in the foods that are best for us. And so that sort of leads a little bit to this idea that, what is it? One man's medicine is another man's poison.
Yeah.
So understanding that there are some basic underlying fundamentals for everybody, but there's going to be some differences depending on your cultural background. I don't know if that really answers your question. I think you probably know a bit more about the Weston Price stuff than I do, but yes, the whole idea that having to eat only lean meat, I think his research has really proved a lot on that. And we're starting to see more stuff come out now, especially when we look at something like the ketogenic diet, which isn't for everybody, but we are seeing amazing results with people who have epilepsy and seizure disorders, migraines that won't go away, any kind of neurological condition, some types of autism, are really benefiting from this ketogenic diet, which is a very high fat, moderate protein, low carbohydrate diet, opposite to what we're told we're supposed to eat. Yes. So I think there's more and more research that's coming out now. Dr. David Perlmutter has done a lot of interesting writing on the topic of fat and the brain itself, and how we need to get away from this fear of fat in our diets and actually be afraid of sugar.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
We only have a few minutes left, and one of the things that I have on my list to ask you about is you have a couple blogs and a workshop that you teach called "How to Deal with Picky Eater Hell." And
Yes.
I mean, so for most parents who are listening to this, it's like, oh yeah, great, this is all good, but like my kids just they won't eat that.
Right.
And so, like, what are what are some tips that you can give, some tools that you can give to parents, and advice to help get them through that difficult transition period from when you're trying to train a new habit into
right, exactly. Yeah. So that is the biggest stumbling block that I hear most with parents as well. I mean, my kid will eat nothing if this is what I put on their plate.
Yeah.
So yes. So the very first thing to remember is to recall that the more picky your child is, the less likely it is that they are in the driver's seat in terms of what they're craving and what the foods are. So they actually really need your help and intervention in order to get over it. Because it's the gut bugs that are driving those particular cravings and that really selective picky eating. And so then a couple of other just really easy things would be to, depending on the age of the child, but little kids tend to respond quite well to being involved. So looking at a picture of a new food and helping you find a recipe and looking at the picture of it and talking about it, oh, that looks really good. And then it shows up on their plate and it's not as like, what is that, right? It's not like scariness, because they're creatures of habit. And they like routine. So if something, all of a sudden, this whole new plate of food appears in front of them, they've never seen it before, they're not likely to approach that with a really open mind. But if you prepare them and spend some time looking at new foods, allow them to pick out a new vegetable or fruit at the market that they'd like to try, if they're old enough to get them involved in preparing the food, that can help as well. So that's one thing. The other thing is to never present a child with an entire plate of food that they don't like.
Yeah.
So always make sure there's something on that plate that they do like. And even my son, every child has their preferences and some things that they're a little bit picky about. And, even in our household where we eat so well, my son's a bit picky about some things. And so if I'm serving him a meal, like last night we had fish and we had beets. Neither one are his favorite things. So I made sure there was green beans on the plate and a few blueberries for him. So there's something on that plate that he sees that he likes. So he doesn't just walk up to the table and go, ugh, right? I don't want to eat that. Like, there's nothing there that I like. And you're immediately going to start with the fight. But if you have something on your plate that they do like, and they're going to come to the table, they're going to sit down with less objection. They're going to eat all those foods that they do like first, and hope that the house is going to burn down before they actually have to eat the stuff they don't like. But then there's your opportunity to come in with some techniques like the 1 bite rule. So that is, you don't have to like it, but you do have to try it.
Yeah.
So, having 1 bite of it gives them that exposure to it and that opportunity to develop their palate. And once you know that they're capable of the 1 bite, then you can start moving the marker a little bit. So in our household, he gets enough of the foods that he does like to fill his belly quite well. And then he gets a few bites of the fish and the beets, enough that I know he's getting enough protein into him. So 4 or 5 bites is realistic for him. And he knows he needs to eat that. He has the choice, though. It's not about you sit at the table till you're finished and that's it. This is the family meal. This is what's prepared. There is nothing else. So if you're hungry, you can eat this. You don't have to eat it, but there's no filling up on snacks and other foods until this is finished.
Yeah.
So you don't have to finish your 4 bites of fish, but before you get to have snacks later, you need to finish your 4 bites of fish.
Yeah.
Because we fill our belly on meals, we don't fill our bellies on snacks.
Yeah.
So those are just a couple of little things that I work with parents, depending on how severe the pickiness is. And sometimes if there's really, if I'm dealing with an autistic child where there's sensory motor stuff that is the issue, like the textures are just not possible, then we start off with like a behavioral modification sort of program where we're using rewards. And sometimes we start as slowly as the new food is just touched to the lips, and then they get a reward for even trying it. And then it's just touching it to their tongue, and then a reward. And then we slowly build. So it really depends where your child is, but there is absolutely a way to get them out of that picky eating. Sometimes there's a little, depends how stubborn your kid is, a couple weeks of pain, but eventually they'll get there, and mealtime becomes more pleasant. You're not having to jump up to make 4 different meals for 5 different people, right? It becomes a lot more relaxing if you can just push through those first few weeks.
Interesting. So you say it's about like 2 weeks that you say like that's kind of typical for a child to develop, new eating habits. Like what are some other timelines that you're starting to see when you're working with other kind of autoimmune inflammatory issues before you start to see, before you can start to see improvements? I know your son was a year before you started to see improvement.
Before we started to see improvement in the actual autoimmune condition itself, but we did see other improvements. Like he was the kind of kid who, and I know I work with a lot of these kids who we are failing to see this as unusual, but the kid who gets sick like every 2 weeks. My son, if the neighbor 5 doors down had a cold and we passed him on the street, Tiago would get it the next day. Like his immune system was just not functioning well. And so a lot of these kids who have this chronic inflammation, the immune system isn't, it's so busy with all the chronic stuff that's going on, it's not able to fight off the little viruses that come in. So if you have a child who even doesn't have a chronic condition, but just gets sick all the time, they would benefit from having a change in their diet as well. And that's one of the first things we noticed. Within the first 3 months, his immune system was better. So he wasn't getting sick all the time. We could actually go a month without him getting some kind of bug. And that's the first thing we started to notice. But again, this is progress in terms of the symptoms of the chronic condition is really going to depend on how severe the condition is. So if it's just something like mild eczema, it could be a couple of months that you could start to notice differences. ADHD, sometimes, depending on the age of the child as well, because the older the child is, the longer that damage has been around, so it takes longer to repair it. But the younger the child is, the quicker you're going to start to see results. So I would usually say, start to look for some improvements in some of the symptoms within like 3 months to 6 months. And then, major conditions like autoimmune or autism or things like that, you're looking at, a year and sometimes more than that to see major results. But with that said, I've had autistic kids who, small symptoms, and that's why it's really important. We always do symptom tracking when I work with parents, so they keep a record of the 3 top symptoms. And so, for an autistic child, it might be eye contact, no eye contact, head banging, and styming. And so they're keeping track of those on a weekly basis. And oftentimes, within a couple of weeks, we can start to see a reduction in some of those symptoms, like some of the styming and the head banging and things that the children are doing as coping mechanisms because they are in pain. As we start to decrease that inflammation in the body, those symptoms start to decrease. So sometimes we do start to see some fairly quick results in some of those things.
Wow, that's incredible. So like what have been some of your kind of more longer term success stories with say autism, for example, because it's becoming more common all the time. I mean, I know several parents that have autistic children, and I, it's a very challenging illness to deal with because it affects every aspect of their life. So like what's possible to take people from A to B? What does that look like?
Well, certainly a lot of the kids that I've worked with personally, the major thing that we start to see is their ability to. It's almost like they come out of a shell, like they're locked in this place where they can't communicate, and a lot of the behaviors that we see come from the frustration of not being able to communicate what's going on for them. And so when we start to bring down that inflammation in the body, that the connections in the brain can start to fire like they're supposed to, and they're suddenly able to, whether it's with direct language or even with their own sign language, they have ways of starting to communicate that they weren't able to. Then we start to see some of the decreasing in the tantrums and the really challenging behaviors that can come along with autism. But I would say the biggest things are the behavioral changes as well as speech. So language, kids that are nonverbal, and then once they've been doing the GAPS diet for a time, the kids are actually able to start, using words, and then eventually starting to put sentences together and communicating in ways that they've been told that would never be possible for them. As well as some of the self-harming behaviors like the head banging and stuff like that. I have to say the best success story that I could share, and she is not a client of mine. I have consulted with her a little bit, but she is a very good friend of mine. Had a son who was diagnosed with autism at 3 years of age. He was nonverbal at that time. They diagnosed him with severe autism, told her that he would never speak. And she refused to accept that, and she went down this road of changing his diet drastically. She does all kinds of alternative therapies with him as well. And he is now, well, boy, I'll tell you, the kid has a bigger vocabulary than I do, and he's like 11 years old. He's a genius. He is actually classified as a genius now. He has relationships with children. He has play dates over here regularly with my son and with our neighborhood kids. And, he's a little quirky. He's always going to be a little quirky, but he is leaps and bounds more able to live up to his full potential than he ever would have been if they had simply just accepted that was that, and that there was nothing to be done about it. So amazing things can absolutely happen.
Wow. That's incredible.
Mm-hmm.
Deborah, we're coming up on an hour here, and so do you have any final thoughts, words of wisdom, anything you'd like to kind of finish off with?
Well, I think the biggest thing is that if you are a parent of a child, or even for yourself, if you've been diagnosed with some kind of chronic illness and you've been sent the message that there's very little that you can do about it, or the treatments are having more side effects for you than benefit, don't give up. You need to look, and you need to find resources, because they're out there. There's options. There's things that you can do that can make a profound difference, and they're simple things, and they're non-invasive. So you as a parent, or you as yourself, have way more power to influence your health and well-being than we are ever given the impression that we do. And so don't be told that there's no way. It's time to find your own way, if that's what you're told.
Absolutely. Deborah, why don't you tell folks about your website and where they can find more information about you? I know you have a ton of free resources available on your site, blogs, podcasts. Where can people find out more about you?
Okay, so they can go to www.kidshealthrevolution.com. And yes, all kinds of free resources there. If they join, it's free to join our community. And when they do that, they get access immediately to 5 downloadable items. One's a leaky gut quiz. There's recipes on there, my 20 fabulous freezer meal recipes. There is a foods cheat sheet. So it's sort of like green light, red light, yellow light foods. So it's a really simple thing to sort of reference in terms of the foods that you should be eating. couple other things that I can't quite remember off the top of my head that are on there, but they're great tools to kind of get you started. And then as well, when you join that, you become part of the private Facebook community where people are able to ask questions, and I'm on there and I answer questions, but we also have a great community of other moms, because other moms who are on this journey are a huge source of information. So it's a great place to just make connections with other parents who are on this path, because sometimes not everybody gets it, and it's nice to have a place to go where you can relate to people who are on the same journey as you are.
No kidding. Wow. That sounds amazing.
Yeah.
Well, excuse me. Thanks so much for taking the time to chat with me today, Deborah. Again, we've been chatting with Deborah Morgan from Kids Health Revolution. And if you like this video, please hit like below, subscribe to the channel. We're going to be doing a ton more videos like this with other experts in the health and wellness field. And also leave your comments, questions below. We'll try to get those answered. And if you have a success story about how you have improved some of the conditions that you've been dealing with through diet and other practices, please share those as well. It's important for us to get the word out about what's possible, how we can take back our food sovereignty, and as Deborah was saying, look after ourselves. There's always an option, and there's a community of people that have already come through this themselves, and we can heal the world together. So, okay, thanks so much, Deborah.
Thank you.
Take care.